I'm Amy O'Connor. I work with Cloudera. So Cloudera is a software vendor. We build the software that holds all the big data in the world. You may have heard about that big data kind of stuff. So most of the financial institutions, a lot of the intel and civilian side of the US government and other governments around the world, 9 out of 10 of the top telcos, most of the retailers in the world are using our platform underneath to store data. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. But what I really want to talk about is really more about how data is being used differently in the world. I've been with Cloudera for 4 years, and prior to that I was with Nokia, and I built and ran the big data team at Nokia. So I was in your shoes trying to figure out, how do I use data differently? Where do I find people to kind of run my projects and do this data science work? What is a data scientist and all that? So we're going to talk about some innovative ways that people are using data, and even before I start, I kind of want to thank you guys for, as a very frequent visitor to California, I want to thank you guys for your work and focusing on making the state even better from a health and a safety and an economic and environmental perspective. So let's just start. Imagine a world where, and this was only a little while ago, scroll back in time. Remember when we didn't have cell phones? It wasn't even that long ago. Remember when you used to reach under your car seat for that map of the book of maps? Remember when you needed to make a phone call and you'd have to stop on the side of the road and find a phone booth? If you think about how much things have changed over the course of the past couple of decades, it's all because of using data in different ways. Now, prior to that, like the 80s and the 90s were a little bit more about kind of using technology to automate processes, and now it's much more towards the, what can we learn from ourselves and the world around us, and how can we use that data to make all of our experiences, to make the services that we provide to whoever we're serving, to make the products that we have much better. So you know how much the world is changing because of this, and you guys of all people know it's everything. It's from health and life sciences to distribution and transportation. It's to what we know about our bodies, how global markets are starting to manage risk. We work with some very large financial institutions that are now looking at, instead of using the macroeconomic models that they've used for decades and decades, they're looking at the fact that those models are taking too long to predict what's changing in world economies, and moving much more towards using data about waves and trends of what citizens are doing to actually look at how economic models are changing. And I'll give you a really simple example there. Remember the incident with Chipotle a year ago where they had the incidents with E. coli, and there was some macroeconomic models that said that within that time period their stock was going to drop by 10%. And there were some folks that used a lot more of kind of social media data to do some different type of modeling and predicted that their stock would drop 30%. And those were the models that were correct. And it's making the big financial institutions of the world wake up to say the way that we've done things for 50 years now has to change. We need to do things differently. And that's kind of across the board. I always like to ask this one question. How many of you guys sleep with your smartphones? Okay. And how many here are lying or using alternative facts to represent their sleep habits here? 76% of Californians sleep with their smartphones, and 33% have fallen asleep with their smartphone in their hand, and 39% reach for their phone before they even reach for their toothbrush or their cup of coffee, which I don't know which order people typically do that in either. 60% of Californians check their phone every hour. This is all about data. It's because you want to find out what's going on with the weather. California is the biggest state for using mobile applications for financial transactions. So everything that we're doing is all about data. It's now about data that's in our hand, that's at our reach, all around us every single day. And that's just one tiny representation of how our world has drastically changed because of data. So now imagine a world where we could use sensors to predict health issues like asthma. And this is one of the leading pediatric institutions in the United States, basically is doing work in the space. they're able to collect data. One of the primary reasons why people are admitted to hospitals is because of asthma type of conditions. And they were able to collect 20 years worth of EPA data, but they weren't able to do anything with that data in their legacy systems. So they could look at it at incident at a time. And now when they move to this new world of using technology and data differently, they were able to start collecting historical data about people that were being admitted to hospitals with asthma-like conditions and correlate those against this EPA data to really come up with ways where they could start to predict when people might start to have these trigger events and to be able to actually handle those events on a much better basis. Some of the other things that they do in this particular pediatric hospital is the bedside monitors. I mean, we all, with our families, at certain points in time, end up in hospitals and situations. And the monitors that are at people's beds, in some of the best institutions, they can only store that data that comes from those monitors for 3 days. So they're not able to see broader windows of time. And now some of these healthcare institutions are now starting to collect and store that bedside monitor data in order to be able to create better care paths to get earlier triggers as to folks' healthcare conditions in order to treat them better. I love talking about this one in California because you don't really have this kind of experience very often, but certainly in every place in our country and in the world, we know that we deal with climate events and we know that we deal with changing climate events. I'll just go there, I won't go any farther than that. But can you imagine using data to better improve service efficiency by delivering like real-time weather response instead of after the fact? So this is actually the state of Kentucky. A couple of years ago, they had a winter where there was just a lot of snow. And they weren't, they need to deploy their resources in order to get them out to be able to clear the roads. You have mudslides and other sorts of things that happen here in California. But in order to really clear the roads and make it safe for first responders to be out there, in order to be able to report conditions. So what the state of Kentucky did was they started collecting data from a lot of their vehicles that actually run these roads and use a lot of the GPS data that's out there in order to get a better understanding as to what was the state of these roads, what was happening with traffic patterns, so that they could take care of safety conditions much more quickly. They started processing 16 million records on a daily basis. Before this, they were able to actually figure out how they needed to clear up after a storm 3 days later. And now they could actually do it within 15 minutes. They knew where they needed to be deploying different resources. The other thing that they did with this interesting data that they collected is they feed it back to Waze. And so they're looking at making other applications that are in citizens' hands work much better so that citizens will know what's actually happening in the roads that they're going to be traveling on. They also can now store data for longer periods of time, which means that they can start to do predictive analytics, because being able to predict the future is a lot about understanding what's happened in the past as well as what's happening right now. And they were able to go from looking at what's happening in these weather conditions to predict bridge maintenance, and it used to take them 3 days in order to basically say after a storm event, they might have an incident where a bridge needed to be repaired, and they were able to bring that down to 15 minutes. So they knew that when they needed to get out and respond to something. They did the same thing where they took the information that they were finding and their insights, and they feed it back out to a Twitter feed. So they're giving their constituency-based information on a real-time basis as to what's happening with the road conditions. Now, you don't have snow, but you do have a lot of other things that happen here in California. Now, imagine a world where we could predict when someone is in danger. You may have heard of Thorn. It's the largest defender. They call themselves the Digital Defenders of Children. It's a nonprofit. And in the U.S. alone, they've found that there's 325,000 children who are at risk for being put into sex trafficking networks. And 71% of those children are actually forced to place their own advertisements online. And what Thorn did in using data right from social media, so think of a Craigslist type of thing, and usual natural language processing on that data, they could identify the potential voice of a child and therefore go and identify that it might be someone who is at risk. And they've been able to save hundreds of children from these networks already. And it's now the largest tool being used by all of the enforcement agencies that are looking into these human trafficking networks. And it's all based upon social media data and that voice, and being able to hear the voices a slight bit under duress and how things are posted online. Now, imagine a world where you could use data to detect something early enough in the cycle that you could prevent something terrible from happening. So sepsis is one of the leading problems inside hospital systems that leads to death. And what Cerner did was they basically took all of their electronic medical records and a lot of that data that I was talking about earlier on human vital signs in order to get a better understanding early on in a cycle when someone was likely to be entering a condition where they would have sepsis. They have been able to save hundreds of lives already, and they've also been able to reduce the number of readmissions into hospitals, which is another major concern in the area of government and health and life sciences. Hospital readmissions in California, while they have been reduced, I think, from 14% down to around 13% over the last couple years, in order to really get to low numbers of readmissions, you need to understand a lot about an individual patient. Often it has less to do with their condition and the immediate treatment that they got than it has to do with the world and their own home environment. Do they have access to follow-up services? Are they able to get access to the medical care that they needed? Are they eating the right types of things? What's their environment actually look like? Are they in a safe kind of place? There's one study that one of the interesting correlations they found was that the best indicator of someone possibly going to be readmitted to a hospital within 30 days of leaving a hospital was the number of words a physician put in their notes on the exit interview. And then basically it's an indicator that this person has a very complex environment and situation, and just simply the number of words that were in those notes had this direct correlation to whether someone might or might not be readmitted. And you can kind of think about this, readmittance to hospital is going to need a lot of understanding as to a patient's environment and what's happening in that space. In this, in the area of health and life sciences, there's two other really interesting waves and trends that are happening that are going to help us all a lot. One is in the area of precision medicine, and that's actually getting down to the medicine, the care of one, the understanding everything about me and my environment and my genome in order to get to a world where I would have the appropriate care path for me. I was talking with somebody recently where they're studying the DNA in order to get a better understanding as to is this a state where medical marijuana is legal? It is. Right? Okay. In order to get a better understanding as to which strains of marijuana are best to give to someone to deal with their particular medical condition. I mean, they're years away from getting to a point where they could actually come up with those kinds of insights, but there's just some pretty amazing things that people are looking at in order to get much more towards healthcare of one. I'm going to talk about security because you're probably all right now about thinking this is way too much data out there. So I will talk about security in just a minute. On the other side of precision medicine is public medicine. So there's also a lot of work being done now in different cities looking for locations where potentially people coming out of certain locations, a couple buildings, a certain block of a city, are ending up with more prevalent health conditions than the norm for the rest of the city. This has happened in Indiana with some research into AIDS, where there was sharing of needles that was happening in certain places that didn't come out of any other studies. And it's happened in a couple other places where they've identified potentially buildings that people are living in or working in that might have health hazards that weren't showing up otherwise. So lots of amazing things in this world. Now, I also always like to say, now imagine something that's out of this world. So the Orion Spacecraft, their first mission was a little while ago, and it basically was a 4-hour mission. Basically what the folks are doing at NASA is they are taking the data off of these spacecrafts in order to ensure that they're going to be able to support human flight over the course of the next decade. And so what they do is they stream data off of the live missions, and then with that data that they stream, they create many different simulation models. And so when they put a human into this certain environment, how is the human going to respond? And their next mission is coming up, and it's going to be 4 times as long as the first one, with twice as many different sensors inside it, in order to really simulate that human condition up in space. So we live in this world that I just talked about, this imagine the world. We already live in it today. We already sleep with our smartphones. We already have these spacecraft that are out there running. We already have people in the health and life sciences world who are starting to get better at predicting health conditions. From commercial businesses to nonprofits to the public sector, I've seen firsthand how businesses and governments are starting to change their relationships with data. And I think the most fundamental change is that we used to look at data as a cost to be managed. And data is moving from the cost side of the equation to the asset side of the equation. Data is now becoming our world's greatest asset to make transformative changes. So when you manage data as a strategic asset, it can help policymakers, it can help officials to manage programs more effectively and efficiently. It will enable you to understand your constituents better. You'll be more equipped to deliver applicable services and in a safe manner while protecting privacy. So I'm going to go technical here for just a couple minutes because you might be wondering, like, okay, so what's underneath all this? It's a lot of data. Back in 1999, when Google had no money, they basically couldn't buy the big, huge compute and storage systems that a lot of us had in our data centers at the time. But they also knew that physically they were going to be looking at using a lot more data than everybody else had. What they were doing is indexing the web on a nightly basis, scraping all these websites, bringing all this data down, indexing it to create the ability for you to search. And so they basically said, okay, we can't afford those big systems, but they're not going to really work anyways. So they invented some new technology, and they wrote some papers on it, and they published the papers, as many folks in Silicon Valley and the California world do. They made their technology available to kind of the world at large. So there's this really sweet guy named Doug Cutting who's about 7 feet tall. He is the chief technology officer at the company I work for, Cloudera. He was at Yahoo at the time, and he read those papers, and he wrote the software, and they started running it at Yahoo. And then Doug left there, and the company that I work for was founded because our founders said, well, this issue that Google and Yahoo have with a lot of data, really, in the next few years, everyone's going to have this issue. There's going to be more and more data in the world, and everyone should have the ability to store and process that data and come up with insights and make transformative decisions and automate decisions. And so that's kind of where this technology came from. It came from Google's papers, implemented at Yahoo, put out in open source, and then commercialized by companies like the one that I work for. And it has come so far. You know, we still kind of think of it as being new. It's 10 years old now. And so it's now running in most of the major financial institutions around the world, the top telecommunications companies, most of the big Intel things and a lot of the public sector things are running on this technology now. And it does a lot more than it originally did. And I'll kind of get into some of those pieces. The one that I did want to mention first and foremost is from a security perspective. We've focused a lot on basically kind of taking it from a lab type of project to a system and a set of systems that can run in your data centers or in the cloud in a very secure manner. And the security is everything from being able to encrypt the data, to provide fine-grained access control on the data, to do the right authentication on the data, to be able to track the lineage of the data. So when we start thinking about these, imagine a world where you could do all this stuff, the system underneath fundamentally has very, very tight security controls and audit controls to enable you to better ensure that data is being used appropriately. So I like to just kind of do this one thing where, so why is this kind of big data world and this stuff that came from Google and went to Yahoo and is out in open source and available commercially now, why is this different from those data warehouses we've been using for a few decades now? And there's kind of, I say the 7 reasons why it's different, and they fall into 3 categories. So first of all, in traditional data warehousing, we kind of were all basically saying we had a question that we wanted answered, now let's go find the data and get just those fields of data to answer the question. Turn that inside out. What we're all doing now is actually collecting data first. So sure, you have an indication of how you're going to use it because you don't randomly collect things without knowing that they're going to have some value to you, but proactively collecting data. which the system allows you to store it in whatever form it came from. So you don't have to do a whole bunch of work, like, oh, it's video, or it comes from a transaction database, or it's social media data. Doesn't matter. Whatever form it's in, it can come into these new big data systems in that form. And then that means that over time, you can transform it over and over again and use it lots of different ways. So 2 years from now, you find some new use for some social media data. Well, you don't have to worry that in the year 2017, somebody on your team only kept this much of it and they put it in a certain form. 2 years from now, you'll be able to go back and kind of look at that historical data. And that really lets you create those the buildup of history, and the buildup of history is the thing that lets you get to predictive modeling and then eventually automated decisions. So that's the first thing, proactively building your data even before you understand all your use cases. And then the second thing is that the aspect of security. So if you're proactively bringing all this data together and you can secure it appropriately, now you can share it in ways across agencies that you possibly never could before, because you're able to really have it there documented appropriately and say, here's the appropriate use. And this creates that whole concept of community data. Some of them, even the use cases I already showed you before, are using what, as opposed to alternative facts, there's a term out there called alternative data, where organizations are starting to use data outside of the data they normally collect. And I'll tell you that one of the biggest data sets that we see across all industries and across the globe is around weather data. Because almost everything in our lives, every service that we deal with, is somehow impacted by weather, one way or the other.
Amy, are you going to take questions as you go or at the end?
How about I'll run through this and we'll take them at the end, if that works? Okay, great. And then here's the other thing. In traditional data warehousing, what you ended up at the end was a report. And you could share reports and people could make decisions off of reports. And there's a little bit sometimes of integration with applications, but not much. Well, the way this big data system works, and you can only imagine because, kind of came from Google originally, you don't want to put a bunch of people in the middle manually reading reports and doing stuff. So what this system allows you to do is to connect what you find, those insights you find from your data, automatically out through APIs to standard SQL applications. Maybe you use Tableau today, or Click, or Zoom Data, or Arcadia. I mean, any of those business intelligence applications you currently use, you can still use on top of the system, as well as being able to connect mobile, web, enterprise applications directly to these insights. So most of the things we use on our phones today, when you're seeing some sort of recommendation come up or prediction come up or any of those applications that you use that do traffic modeling inside maps, they are all connecting in near real time to some of these big data engines that sit on the back end. Okay, so what is all this data? And I always like to flash up a slide like this just to get you thinking about the fact that there's so much data out there. Often we tend to think about just the things we've already used and only in certain forms. But when you let your imagination flow, you can really have an understanding that there's lots and lots of different data that's out there in the world, potentially already available to you or potentially available to you through your partnerships with other agencies, available to you through open data initiatives, through other types of organizations, third-party organizations, that will enable you to really take what you're doing and add more data sets. And then the second thing that this is about, so it's about a lot more data. Now, we're not talking any longer like gigabytes or even terabytes of data. We're really talking about really big data sets. So when you have really big data sets, some cool things can happen. Traditional statistics was always about finding a representative sample of the population. Remember all that in your stats class? What's your sample and how do you get bias out of selecting your sample? And so traditional statistics is, and I'm using this basketballs here, I figured because the NBA Finals and the Golden State Warriors, and I thought maybe somebody might care about all this that's going on. Because you got you guys on the traditional statistics thing from a Golden State Warrior perspective are doing pretty well. Baskets made, points served, steals, you all got, the Warriors are way up there. LeBron's only got you on assists, so we got to keep an eye on the assists going on here. That's traditional statistics. Then there's statistical modeling, which is starting to take multiple different factors and put them together to make different types of predictions. And those still are a little bit more around using sample sets of data. You have to pick your right samples, do your right type of modeling there. But now we're moving into this world of machine learning. And the easiest way for me to think about machine learning is, first of all, a honking lot more data, tons and tons of data, which a human being couldn't possibly go through. So now you can have your machines start to do things like look for patterns, look for things that are happening in those data sets that you might never have even thought about. And there's multiple different machine learning mechanisms, and there's lots of tools out there that can help you to do machine learning. But in essence, that's what it is. It's the unknown unknowns. It's the I couldn't even possibly have imagined that this kind of thing was out there. And in the world of basketball, one area that's being applied to is the idea of the expected possession value. Was a lot of focus on this. So a couple years ago, the NBA instrumented all of the arenas for the 30 basketball teams with video cameras up in the ceiling. And they're taking optical measurements continually through these games. And there are two-dimensional measurements to see where a player is. And what they're working on doing by collecting more and more data as every season goes on is they're looking at what is the best path from an inbound pass to a pass across the court to a pass to someone else that it eventually ends up in a basket versus another path that goes a different way. And that's the whole idea of this expected possession value. They're still a long ways away from it, but the more data they collect, these machine learning algorithms are getting them to better understand, well, you know, if LeBron had so many more assists this time than Curry did, then is that a better thing because he was somewhere else in that whole possession thing? So that's kind of one way of thinking about machine learning.